In a bustling city, tensions simmered beneath the surface, hidden behind uniforms of authority and the badge that symbolized order and law. Captain Brianna Wilson, one of the most respected officers in the department, was known for her sharp mind, integrity, and dedication to the community. A black woman who had risen through the ranks through hard work and perseverance, she was a symbol of what law enforcement could be: fair, just, and compassionate. However, not everyone shared this view. Officer Daniel Hayes, a cop with a reputation for harboring discriminatory views, had long harbored resentment toward Brianna. He could never comprehend how someone like her, someone he saw as lesser due to the color of her skin, could hold a higher rank than him. His deep-seated prejudices festered, and one fateful day, they erupted in an ugly display of power and bigotry. During an investigation at a local store, Brianna was overseeing a routine operation. Without warning, Daniel accused her of stealing merchandise from the store. The baseless accusation stunned the entire team, but Daniel, drunk on the power his uniform provided, didn't hesitate. He humiliated her publicly, making vile comments and placing her in handcuffs, much to the horror of onlookers. Despite her protests and the absurdity of the situation, Brianna was forcibly led away, her dignity in tatters. But karma has a way of catching up. Captain Brianna Wilson had always believed in justice. It was, after all, the very foundation of why she had joined the police force. As a young girl growing up in a rough neighborhood in Chicago, she had seen firsthand the impact of crime and the importance of good policing. Her father, a hardworking mechanic, had often spoken of the neighborhood's need for honest people, people who could make a difference. That desire to make a difference had propelled Brianna through her studies, through the academy, and eventually through the ranks to become one of the most respected captains in her precinct. But respect wasn't something that came easily for a black woman in law enforcement. Brianna had learned that early on. The road was full of obstacles, from the blatant racism she encountered during her early days on the force, to the subtle, insidious forms of prejudice that lurked beneath the surface even among her peers. Yet she had persevered, using every setback as fuel to push herself harder, to prove herself time and time again. On this particular morning, Brianna stood at the head of the room, addressing her team of officers before they went out on patrol. It was a routine briefing, nothing out of the ordinary. The room was filled with familiar faces, men and women she had worked with for years, and some newer recruits still finding their footing. The atmosphere was light, as it often was during these morning meetings. The officers chatted quietly among themselves, sipping coffee, reviewing their notes for the day ahead. Brianna's sharp eyes swept across the room as she outlined the details of the day's operations. There had been a string of thefts at a local electronics store, and the department had been called in to investigate. It wasn't a particularly high-profile case, but it was important nonetheless. Brianna's philosophy had always been that every case mattered, no matter how small. She emphasized this to her officers every chance she got. Officer Daniel Hayes, seated near the back of the room, was half listening, his eyes fixed on Brianna with barely concealed disdain. He had never liked her, and everyone in the precinct knew it. It wasn't just that she was his superior, it was who she was. A black woman who had risen through the ranks, a woman he believed didn't deserve to wear the badge she proudly bore on her chest. Daniel had his own views about who belonged in leadership positions, and in his mind, Brianna wasn't one of them. As Brianna continued with her briefing, Daniel's mind drifted. He couldn't stand the way she commanded the room, the way the other officers respected her. It gnawed at him every time he saw her in that position of power, a position he believed was rightfully his. He had been on the force for nearly as long as she had, but while Brianna had climbed the ladder with determination and grace, Daniel had stagnated, his career held back by his own actions and attitude, though he would never admit that to himself. Brianna finished her briefing, wrapping it up with her usual words of encouragement. "Remember," she said, her voice firm but kind, "every call, every case, no matter how small, deserves our full attention. The people out there are counting on us to do our jobs with integrity and respect. Let's give them that." The officers nodded in agreement, some offering her small smiles of support, but Daniel, as usual, remained stoic, his expression hard as stone. "All right, team," Brianna said, glancing at her watch. Let's get out there. As the officers filed out of the room, Brianna caught sight of Daniel lingering near the door. She wasn't blind to his attitude toward her. She had noticed it from the moment they first met. But Brianna had long since learned to ignore the resentment of those who couldn't handle her success. She gave him a brief nod, which he did not return, and turned her attention to the paperwork on her desk. The electronics store was bustling with activity when Brianna and her team arrived. Customers browsed the shelves and employees rushed around, assisting them. The store manager, a tall man in his late 50s with graying hair and an anxious demeanor, greeted Brianna and her officers at the entrance. "Thank you for coming, Captain Wilson," the manager said, shaking her hand with a nervous grip. "We've had 3 incidents in the past week. Expensive items going missing, laptops, tablets, things like that. We've checked the cameras, but there's nothing clear." Brianna nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. "We'll take a look around, and I'll need access to your security footage." "Of course," the manager replied, leading them inside. Brianna split her team up to cover different areas of the store. She, along with 2 other officers, went to the back to review the security footage, while Daniel and another officer, Sarah, were assigned to the floor to interview employees and keep an eye on things. Daniel, however, had other plans. As he walked through the store, his eyes kept drifting back to Brianna. He watched her interact with the manager, saw the way she commanded respect with ease. It infuriated him. He was already convinced that Brianna had gotten to where she was because of some unfair advantage. Affirmative action, quotas, whatever excuse he could think of. It didn't matter to him that she was more than qualified, that she had earned her position through hard work and dedication. In his mind, she was an imposter, and today, he was going to prove it. As Brianna reviewed the security footage, her attention focused on the screens in front of her. Daniel moved toward the back of the store, slipping into the area where high-end electronics were stored. His eyes scanned the shelves, and he waited for the perfect moment. When he was sure no one was looking, he grabbed a small, expensive tablet and slid it into his pocket. He knew exactly what he was going to do next. The day had barely begun. After about an hour of investigation, Brianna returned to the floor to check on the progress of her team. As she walked past one of the display shelves, she noticed Daniel standing nearby, his posture tense, eyes locked on her. Before she could ask if everything was all right, Daniel spoke. "Captain Wilson," he called out, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "I need to speak with you." Brianna frowned, noting the sharpness in his tone. "What is it, Officer Hayes?" Daniel stepped closer, his hand resting on the handcuffs at his belt. "I saw you take something from the store." The words hit Brianna like a punch to the gut. For a moment, she couldn't believe what she had heard. Her mind raced, trying to process the absurdity of the accusation. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice calm but incredulous. Daniel's expression was hard, unyielding. "Don't play games, Captain. I saw you steal a tablet from that display over there. You slipped it into your jacket." Brianna's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her composure. "That's a serious accusation, Officer Hayes. I hope you have proof." "I saw it with my own eyes," Daniel replied, his voice growing louder. "You're not above the law, Captain. I'm placing you under arrest." A hush fell over the store as customers and employees alike turned to watch the scene unfolding before them. Brianna's fellow officers, shocked and confused, exchanged uneasy glances. They had worked with Brianna for years. None of them believed for a second that she would do such a thing. Brianna held her ground, refusing to let Daniel's accusation rattle her. "This is ridiculous, Daniel. You're making a mistake." But Daniel was relentless. He stepped forward, pulling out his handcuffs. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." For the first time in her career, Brianna felt powerless. She had spent years fighting for justice, standing up against discrimination and corruption within the force. But now, here she was, being humiliated in front of her peers and the public by one of her own officers. She knew she could resist. She could refuse to comply and make a scene. But that wasn't who she was. Brianna had always believed in the law, even when the law failed her. She wasn't going to give Daniel the satisfaction of seeing her fight back. Silently, she turned around and allowed him to cuff her. The metal dug into her wrists, cold and unforgiving. The cameras of bystanders and employees were already out, recording the event. The entire store was watching as Brianna Wilson, the woman who had dedicated her life to upholding the law, was led out of the store in handcuffs. The ride back to the precinct was a blur. Captain Brianna Wilson sat in the back of the squad car, her hands still cuffed, staring out the window as the city streets passed by in a haze of muted colors and distant sounds. Her mind, usually sharp and focused, struggled to process what had just happened. Daniel Hayes, an officer she had worked with for years, had humiliated and arrested her in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, for a crime she didn't commit. The weight of the handcuffs felt heavier than any burden she had ever carried. At the precinct, officers and staff exchanged confused, bewildered glances as they watched Brianna being led through the station in cuffs. Some whispered amongst themselves, wondering what could have led to this. Others were too stunned to speak, their disbelief evident in their wide eyes and furrowed brows. But Brianna walked through the precinct with her head held high. She refused to let the shame of the moment break her spirit. She had faced adversity before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a personal attack. It was an attack on everything she stood for, everything she had worked to achieve in her career. Daniel marched her into the holding area with an air of triumph, his grip on her arm too tight, his face flushed with the thrill of having taken down the woman he had always resented. As they reached the processing desk, Officer Sarah Ramirez, who had been one of Brianna's closest colleagues, stepped forward, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Daniel, what the hell is going on?" Sarah demanded, her voice low but firm. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He was too focused on making a show of processing Brianna, handing her over to the officer behind the desk as if she were just another criminal being booked. Brianna stood silent, her eyes meeting Sarah's with a look that said more than words ever could. Finally, Daniel turned to Sarah, his lips curling into a smug smile. "Captain Wilson was caught stealing from the electronics store. I saw it with my own eyes." Sarah's mouth dropped open in shock. "What? That's impossible." "Believe it," Daniel replied, his voice dripping with false authority. "No one's above the law, not even a captain." Sarah's eyes flicked between Daniel and Brianna. Disbelief etched into every line of her face. "Daniel, you can't be serious. Brianna would never—" "Enough, Sarah," Daniel interrupted, his tone harsh. "This isn't up for debate. We all saw what happened." Sarah's gaze hardened, but she said nothing more. She knew better than to argue with Daniel in front of the other officers, especially when tensions were running this high. But as Brianna was led away to a holding cell, Sarah's mind raced. Something wasn't right, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. As the hours passed, the precinct buzzed with activity. The news of Brianna's arrest had spread quickly, and it wasn't long before the media caught wind of the story. Local reporters camped outside the station, their cameras ready to capture any scrap of information they could get. The story was already making headlines. Police captain arrested for alleged theft. Internal corruption or false accusation? Inside the station, the mood was tense. Brianna's fellow officers were divided. Some, like Sarah, were convinced that something was wrong, that Brianna was being set up. Others, however, were more hesitant to question Daniel's version of events. After all, he had been the one to witness the alleged crime. In their minds, they couldn't imagine that one of their own would lie about something so serious. In a small, dimly lit office, Chief Harrison Calloway sat behind his desk, a frown deepening the lines on his already weathered face. He had known Brianna for years, watched her rise through the ranks, saw her grow into the capable, respected leader she had become. The idea that she could have stolen anything, let alone from a store while on duty, was preposterous. But the optics were bad, very bad. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice gruff. The door opened, and Sarah stepped inside. She looked shaken, her usual calm composure replaced with worry. "Chief," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "We need to talk about Brianna. Something's not right." Harrison gestured for her to sit. "I know, Sarah, but we have to follow protocol. An accusation was made, and there are witnesses. We can't just sweep this under the rug." "I understand that," Sarah replied, taking a seat across from him. "But I've worked with Brianna for years. You have too. You know as well as I do that she would never do something like this." The chief sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I know, but we need evidence. Something concrete to disprove Daniel's accusation. Until we have that, my hands are tied. Then let's find the evidence, Sarah said, her voice growing more determined. We need to go back to the store, review the footage, talk to the employees. There has to be something we're missing. Harrison nodded slowly, considering her words. All right, I'll authorize you to go back and take another look. But tread carefully, Sarah. This situation is already a mess, and the last thing we need is more controversy. Sarah stood, her resolve firm. I'll get to the bottom of this, Chief. I won't let Brianna take the fall for something she didn't do. That afternoon, Sarah, along with a small team of trusted officers, returned to the electronics store. The atmosphere inside was tense, with employees still shaken by the events of the morning. Sarah approached the store manager, who seemed visibly nervous, his eyes darting around as if he expected more trouble. Captain Wilson was a regular here, the manager explained, his voice trembling slightly. She always stopped by to check on things, make sure we were safe. I can't believe what happened. Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Brianna's reputation was already being dragged through the mud, even in places where she had been known and respected. I need to see the security footage, Sarah said, her tone professional but urgent. The manager led her to the back room where the security system was housed. Sarah's pulse quickened as the manager pulled up the footage from earlier in the day. She watched intently, her eyes scanning the screen for any sign of wrongdoing. The footage showed Brianna walking through the store, her expression focused as she spoke with employees and surveyed the area. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There was no moment where she appeared to take anything, no suspicious behavior at all. But then Sarah noticed something. As Brianna turned down one of the aisles, Daniel appeared in the background. He was standing near a display case, his eyes fixed on Brianna. Sarah watched as Daniel moved toward the display, his hand reaching for something. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to show that Daniel had taken something from the shelf. Sarah's heart raced as she paused the footage and zoomed in. There it was, the tablet that Daniel had accused Brianna of stealing, but it was Daniel who had taken it. A cold chill ran down her spine as she realized the truth. Daniel had set Brianna up. He had framed her, used his position of power to carry out a personal vendetta. The betrayal cut deep, and Sarah felt a wave of anger rise within her. This was bigger than just a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of malice, a calculated attempt to ruin Brianna's career and reputation. Sarah immediately called Chief Calloway, her voice urgent as she explained what she had found. By the time Sarah returned to the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted. Word of her discovery had spread among the officers, and the tension was palpable. Daniel, who had been walking around with an air of smug superiority since Brianna's arrest, was now the one under scrutiny. Sarah wasted no time. She marched straight to Chief Calloway's office, the evidence in hand. Inside, the chief sat with a grim expression, knowing full well that this situation had taken a dark turn. You were right, Sarah said as she handed him the footage. Daniel framed her. Chief Calloway watched the footage in silence, his face growing darker with each passing second. When the video finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed in frustration. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. This is bad. Really bad. We need to arrest him, Sarah said firmly. He can't get away with this. Calloway nodded, but there was a weariness in his eyes. This won't be easy. The department is already under fire, and this is going to blow everything wide open. But we have no choice. He stood, straightening his uniform. Let's do this. It wasn't long before the precinct was once again buzzing with activity. But this time, the focus wasn't on Brianna. It was on Daniel. As Chief Calloway and Sarah approached Daniel's desk, a hush fell over the room. Officers looked on with a mixture of curiosity and unease, unsure of what was about to happen. Daniel, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stood up, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the determined expressions on their faces. Chief, he said, his voice laced with suspicion. Calloway didn't waste any time. Daniel Hayes, you're under arrest for the false accusation and unlawful arrest of Captain Brianna Wilson. Daniel's face went pale. What? You can't be serious. But Sarah stepped forward, holding up the footage. We have evidence, Daniel. You planted the tablet. You set her up. For a moment, Daniel stood frozen, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. But there was no escape. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. Officers began to move in, placing handcuffs on Daniel's wrists. He struggled for a moment, but it was no use. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, all of it was crumbling before his eyes. As Daniel was led away, the precinct was eerily silent. Brianna's name had been cleared, but the damage had already been done. The department would never be the same. The sun was setting when Brianna Wilson finally walked out of the precinct, free from the handcuffs that had bound her. It had been hours since Sarah had uncovered the truth, and Chief Calloway had reluctantly ordered her release. But despite her freedom, Brianna knew that her ordeal was far from over. The humiliation she had endured wasn't something that could be easily erased. The images of her being led away in handcuffs had already made their rounds on social media, and the damage to her reputation was profound. The streets outside the precinct were quiet, but Brianna could feel the weight of the public's eyes on her. News outlets were still running the story of her arrest, though now the narrative had shifted. The headlines no longer screamed accusations of theft, but instead spoke of betrayal, corruption, and the fallout of a department divided. As Brianna walked toward her car, parked a few blocks away to avoid the media frenzy, she thought of all that had been lost. Her trust in the system that she had spent her life defending had been shattered. The badge she had once worn with pride now felt like a symbol of everything that was broken. Sarah caught up with her just as she reached her car. "Brianna, wait." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. Brianna paused, turning to face her friend. She saw the concern in Sarah's eyes, the guilt that weighed heavily on her. Sarah had been one of the few to stand by her, but even she couldn't stop what had happened. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, her voice cracking slightly. "I should have seen this coming. I should have done more." Brianna shook her head, offering a tired smile. "You did enough, Sarah. You found the truth when no one else would." "But it shouldn't have come to this," Sarah replied, her fists clenched at her sides. Daniel will get what's coming to him," Brianna interrupted, her tone firm. "But this isn't just about him. This is about the system that allowed someone like him to thrive. And now, I have to figure out how to fight back." Brianna's first week back in the public eye was nothing short of chaos. As soon as the news of Daniel's arrest broke, the media had swarmed the police department, desperate for any new developments. The story had gone from a simple theft accusation to a full-blown scandal about systemic racism, corruption, and betrayal within the force. Everywhere Brianna went, she was followed by cameras, reporters shouting questions at her, and social media was flooded with opinions from all sides. Some hailed her as a hero, a symbol of resilience against injustice. Others doubted her, claiming that there was more to the story, that perhaps she wasn't as innocent as the footage suggested. It was exhausting, and no matter how much Brianna tried to keep her focus, the constant scrutiny began to wear her down. But through it all, she maintained her dignity, refusing to let the media storm dictate her actions. One morning, as she walked out of her apartment, a swarm of reporters surrounded her. Their voices overlapped, shouting questions and accusations, hoping for a reaction. "Captain Wilson, how do you feel about Daniel Hayes' arrest? Do you think this incident reflects the deep-rooted racism within the department? Are you planning to sue the police force?" Brianna took a deep breath, holding her composure. She had never been one to seek the spotlight, but she knew that staying silent wasn't an option. Not anymore. She stopped in her tracks, raising her hand to quiet the crowd. The reporters fell silent, their cameras focused on her, waiting for her to speak. "I am grateful for the support I've received from my community, my colleagues, and everyone who believed in my innocence," she began, her voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. This is about a system that failed, a system that allowed an officer to abuse his power and ruin lives. I won't stand for it, and neither should any of you." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the reporters buzzing with new headlines and angles for their stories. Brianna knew that in order to truly clear her name and seek justice for what had happened, she needed to take legal action. It wasn't just about holding Daniel accountable. It was about addressing the systemic issues that had allowed his actions to go unchecked for so long. Her first step was to meet with a lawyer. After doing her research, she found someone who specialized in civil rights cases, someone who had experience taking on corrupt institutions and winning. Her name was Evelyn Mercer, a fierce, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for getting results. Brianna walked into Evelyn's downtown office, feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. She had never been one to rely on others to fight her battles. But this was different. This was bigger than her, and she needed someone who could navigate the legal system and hold the police department accountable for their failures. Evelyn greeted her with a firm handshake, her sharp eyes assessing Brianna as she sat down across from her desk. "I've read about your case," Evelyn began, getting straight to the point, "and let me just say, you've got a hell of a fight ahead of you." Brianna nodded, her jaw set. "I know. But I also believe you've got a strong case," Evelyn continued. "What Daniel Hayes did was not only unethical, but illegal. And if we play our cards right, we can not only hold him accountable, but also expose the systemic issues that allowed this to happen in the first place." "That's exactly what I want," Brianna replied, her voice steady. "This isn't just about him. It's about the culture within the department. The racism, the sexism, the corruption. It needs to change." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Good, because I don't take on cases that aren't about real change. Let's get started." While Brianna prepared for her legal battle, the police department was in full damage control mode. Chief Calloway, who had always been a pragmatist, knew that the department's reputation was hanging by a thread. The media was relentless, and public trust in the force was at an all-time low. Internally, the atmosphere was tense. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to Daniel's behavior were now scrambling to distance themselves from him. The department's leadership was under intense pressure to address the systemic issues that had been brought to light. But change was slow and met with resistance from within. As Brianna's lawsuit gained traction, the department began to feel the heat. Calls for reform grew louder, and community leaders demanded accountability. Protests erupted outside the precinct, with activists calling for a complete overhaul of the police force and the removal of officers who had allowed corruption to fester. Chief Calloway held several press conferences, trying to appease the public and reassure them that changes were being made. But behind closed doors, he knew that the department was in serious trouble. The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse was packed with reporters, community members, and officers from the precinct. Brianna sat beside Evelyn, her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared to face Daniel in court. Daniel, now out on bail, sat across the room with his defense team. His once confident demeanor had been replaced with a look of desperation. He knew that his career was over, but he still held out hope that the system would protect him, as it always had. The trial was a grueling process, with both sides presenting their arguments and evidence. Evelyn was relentless, using the security footage, witness testimonies, and Daniel's history of misconduct to build a case that was impossible to refute. Throughout the trial, Brianna remained calm, her eyes focused on the proceedings. She had already endured so much, but she knew that this was her moment to reclaim her dignity and seek justice for everything she had lost. As the days dragged on, it became clear that the tide was turning in Brianna's favor. The evidence against Daniel was overwhelming, and his defense team struggled to refute the claims. But it wasn't just Daniel on trial. The entire police department was under scrutiny, and the systemic issues that had allowed someone like him to thrive were being exposed for the world to see. The turning point in the trial came when Brianna took the stand. Her testimony was powerful, her voice unwavering as she recounted the events leading up to her arrest. She spoke not only of the personal betrayal she had experienced, but also of the larger issues within the department. The racism, the sexism, the culture of silence that had allowed corruption to go unchecked. "I've spent my entire career fighting for justice," Brianna said, her eyes locked on the jury. "But the system I believed in betrayed me. It allowed someone like Daniel Hayes to abuse his power, and it nearly destroyed everything I've worked for. But this isn't just about me. It's about the countless others who have been wronged by a system that protects the corrupt and punishes the innocent. And it's time for that to change." The courtroom was silent as Brianna spoke, her words resonating with everyone in the room. Even the jurors, who had been impartial up to that point, seemed moved by her testimony. When Brianna stepped down from the stand, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had said everything she needed to say, and now it was up to the jury to decide the outcome. After days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the foreman stood to deliver the decision. We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Hayes, guilty of false accusation, unlawful arrest, and abuse of power. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Brianna closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the past few months lift from her shoulders. She had won. But it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system, for everyone who had fought for justice and been silenced. And it was only the beginning. In the weeks following the trial, Brianna's lawsuit against the department moved forward. The police force, eager to avoid further scandal, agreed to settle, offering Brianna compensation for the damages she had suffered. But more importantly, they committed to implementing reforms that would address the systemic issues within the department. Brianna, however, wasn't interested in the money. What mattered to her was that real change was being made. She continued to work with community leaders and activists, pushing for accountability and transparency within law enforcement. She became a vocal advocate for police reform, using her platform to speak out against injustice and fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Her reputation, once tarnished by Daniel's lies, was now stronger than ever. She had been through hell and back, but she had emerged on the other side more determined than ever to make a difference. As she stood on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and reporters, Brianna smiled. She had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her purpose, and she knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The courthouse was quiet now, the media frenzy finally dying down after the verdict had been delivered. Brianna stood on the steps, staring out at the fading sun, trying to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. She had won. The jury had seen through Daniel Hayes' lies, and justice had been served. Yet despite the victory, Brianna couldn't help but feel that the battle was far from over. In the weeks following the trial, the story of Brianna Wilson's wrongful arrest and the exposure of systemic corruption in the police department had become a nationwide topic. News outlets across the country covered her case, and Brianna had become something of an unwilling celebrity. Civil rights groups hailed her as a symbol of resilience and courage, while others used her story as a rallying cry for police reform. But with the attention came new challenges. Her phone rang constantly, with offers from TV networks, journalists, and organizations wanting her to speak at events or share her story. She had become the face of a movement she hadn't asked to lead, and the pressure was overwhelming. Brianna had always been a private person, content with doing her job quietly and effectively. Now her face was plastered across newspapers, social media, and television screens. She had to navigate a new reality, where every move she made was scrutinized, every word she said dissected. And while she was grateful for the support, she knew that the road ahead was long and filled with uncertainty. Back at the precinct, the ripple effects of Brianna's case were being felt deeply. The police department was in the midst of a transformation, or at least the beginning of one. Following the trial, Chief Harrison Calloway had come under intense scrutiny. Many in the community, as well as within the force, questioned how he had allowed someone like Daniel Hayes to operate unchecked for so long. Pressure from community leaders, activists, and even city officials forced Calloway to implement immediate reforms. These included mandatory racial bias training, stricter oversight of officer conduct, and the establishment of an independent review board to investigate complaints against officers. But for many, these changes felt like too little, too late. Within the department, tensions ran high. Some officers resented the reforms, feeling that they were being unfairly targeted or that the department was bending to public pressure. Others, particularly the younger and more progressive officers, welcomed the changes, seeing them as necessary steps toward rebuilding trust with the community. Brianna, who had been reinstated as captain following her exoneration, found herself at the center of this turmoil. Her return to the force was met with mixed reactions. While many of her colleagues were supportive and relieved to see her back, others were wary. Some still harbored resentment, believing that she had brought negative attention to the department, while others were uncomfortable with the reforms her case had spurred. As Brianna walked through the halls of the precinct on her first day back, She could feel the weight of their stares, the whispers, the sideways glances. They were impossible to ignore. But Brianna had faced worse. She had been humiliated, betrayed, and nearly destroyed, yet she had come out stronger. As she settled into her office, she was met with a familiar face. "Hey, Captain," Sarah Ramirez said with a smile, leaning against the doorway. Brianna looked up, a genuine smile tugging at her lips. "Hey, Sarah. It's good to be back." "Good doesn't even begin to cover it," Sarah replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "You've been through hell and back, and now look at you. A walking, talking symbol of resilience." Brianna chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to do my job and live my life. Now I'm not sure what to do with all the attention." Sarah sat down across from her, her expression softening. "You don't have to be a symbol if you don't want to be. But whether you like it or not, people are looking to you for leadership, not just in here, but out there too." Brianna sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I know, but I'm not sure I'm cut out for that kind of role. I've spent my whole life trying to do things quietly under the radar. Now, everything's changed." "That may be true," Sarah said, her voice thoughtful, "but maybe it's time for a new kind of leadership, one that's not just about wearing a badge, but about changing the system from the inside." Brianna nodded slowly, her mind turning over Sarah's words. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was her opportunity to make a real difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the same system that had nearly destroyed her. While Brianna tried to adjust to her new role within the department, the community outside was undergoing its own transformation. The protests that had erupted after her arrest had not dissipated with the verdict. If anything, they had grown louder, more determined. Activists called for deeper reforms, not just within the police department, but across the entire justice system. Brianna found herself being pulled into this movement, whether she wanted to be or not. Community leaders reached out to her, inviting her to speak at rallies and town hall meetings. Civil rights organizations asked her to join their efforts in lobbying for legislative changes. At first, Brianna resisted. She wasn't sure she was ready to take on such a public role, especially so soon after everything she had been through. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't just stand on the sidelines. One evening, as she sat in her apartment scrolling through the countless messages of support she had received, she came across a letter from a young girl named Maya. The letter was simple, written in neat, careful handwriting, but it struck a chord deep within Brianna. "Dear Captain Wilson, my name is Maya, and I'm 10 years old. My mom and I saw what happened to you on the news. My mom says that people like you are brave, and that we need more people like you to help make things better for everyone. When I grow up, I want to be like you. Thank you for being strong and for standing up for what's right. Love, Maya." Brianna stared at the letter for a long time, her heart swelling with emotion. This was bigger than her, bigger than the department, bigger than the trial. People were looking to her for hope, for change, and maybe, just maybe, she had a responsibility to live up to those expectations. As Brianna slowly began to embrace her new role in the movement for justice, she found herself navigating a delicate balance between her public and private lives. The attention was overwhelming at times, and while she appreciated the support, she longed for moments of quiet, moments where she could simply be Brianna Wilson, a woman who had been through a lot and needed time to heal. Her relationships with those closest to her also began to change. Some, like Sarah, had been with her every step of the way, offering unwavering support, but others had pulled away, unsure of how to handle the attention and the pressure that came with being associated with Brianna. One evening, Brianna met up with her younger brother Marcus at a small cafe they had frequented since they were kids. Marcus, always the protective older brother, had been one of her fiercest supporters throughout the ordeal, but even he had his limits. "You've been all over the news, Bri," Marcus said, taking a sip of his coffee. "I mean, I always knew you were tough, but damn, you've become a superhero or something." Brianna smiled weakly, stirring her tea. "I wouldn't go that far. I'm just trying to survive like everyone else." "Yeah, but not everyone else has been through what you have," Marcus replied, his tone serious. "And now people are looking to you to fix everything. That's a lot of pressure." Brianna nodded, her gaze dropping to the table. "I know, and I'm trying to figure out how to handle it. I want to help. I really do, but I'm not sure I'm cut out for all of this. Marcus reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. You've always been a fighter, Bree. You don't need to do this alone. Just remember that. Brianna smiled, squeezing his hand in return. Thanks, Marcus. I don't know what I'd do without you. As Brianna became more involved in the movement for justice, she found herself stepping into the world of politics, a place she had never imagined herself. Local politicians, activists, and community leaders all wanted her voice on their side, and Brianna had to learn quickly how to navigate the complexities of this new landscape. She began attending meetings with city officials, discussing potential reforms to the police department and the justice system as a whole. It was a steep learning curve, but Brianna was determined to make the most of her platform. One day she was invited to speak at a town hall meeting where the mayor and several city council members were present. The topic of the meeting was police reform, and tensions in the room were high. Community members, many of whom had experienced their own injustices at the hands of the police, were demanding immediate action, while the city officials were hesitant, citing concerns about budget cuts and resistance from the police unions. When it was Brianna's turn to speak, she stood before the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she looked out at the faces of the people who had supported her, who had marched in the streets for her, she found her voice. Reform isn't just a buzzword, Brianna began, her voice steady but filled with passion. It's not something we can push off until it's convenient or politically advantageous. It's something that needs to happen now. People's lives are at stake. Trust in law enforcement is at an all-time low, and for good reason. We can't afford to wait any longer. The room was silent as Brianna spoke, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. She didn't hold back, calling out the systemic issues that had plagued the department for years and demanding real, tangible change. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Brianna felt like she was truly making a difference. Just as Brianna was beginning to find her footing in her new role as a public figure and advocate for justice, a new challenge emerged, one that would test her resolve and push her to her limits. One afternoon, as Brianna was leaving a meeting with city officials, she received a call from Evelyn Mercer, her lawyer. "Brianna, we have a problem," Evelyn said, her voice tense. Brianna's heart sank. "What is it?" "There's been a countersuit," Evelyn replied. "Daniel Hayes is suing you for defamation." Brianna stopped in her tracks, the weight of Evelyn's words sinking in. "What? How is that even possible? He's the one who—" "I know," Evelyn interrupted, her voice calming. "But his legal team is claiming that your public statements after the trial have damaged his reputation and career. They're trying to frame it as a case of defamation and character assassination." Brianna couldn't believe what she was hearing. After everything Daniel had done to her, after all the lies he had told and the pain he had caused, now he was trying to turn the tables on her. "What do we do?" Brianna asked, her voice tight with frustration. "We fight it," Evelyn replied firmly. "We'll file a countersuit and build a case to show that everything you've said is based on the truth. But this is going to get ugly, Brianna. They're going to come after you with everything they have." Brianna closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She had fought hard to clear her name and rebuild her life, and now it seemed like the fight was far from over. But as the familiar feeling of determination welled up inside her, Brianna knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going down without a fight. As Brianna prepared for yet another legal battle, she realized that her journey was far from over. The road to justice and reform was long, and there would be many more obstacles along the way. But she was no longer the woman who had been wrongfully arrested and humiliated. She was stronger now, more resilient, and more determined than ever to fight for what was right. With the support of her community, her family, and her colleagues, Brianna knew that she could face whatever challenges came her way. The fight for justice wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been wronged by a broken system, and Brianna was ready to lead that fight, no matter the cost. Brianna sat at her kitchen table, her hands cradling a warm cup of tea, but the comfort the tea usually brought her wasn't there. The silence of her apartment was deafening, and despite the victory in her previous trial, there was no sense of relief. The letter she had received earlier that day lay open in front of her, its contents heavy with implications. Daniel Hayes had filed a defamation lawsuit against her, Her heart felt like a stone in her chest. After everything she had been through, the humiliation, the arrest, the public spectacle, Daniel had found another way to come after her. It was almost surreal. She had proven her innocence, exposed his lies, and now he was trying to turn the tables, to paint himself as the victim in this story. Brianna had expected many things after the trial: scrutiny, pressure, and even backlash from those within the police department who didn't support the reform she was fighting for. But this was another blow, one that threatened to drag her back into the turmoil she had only just begun to escape. As she stared at the letter, she felt a surge of anger rise within her. Daniel Hayes wasn't just coming after her reputation. He was trying to silence her, to punish her for standing up against him and the system that had allowed him to act with impunity. But Brianna was no longer the woman who had been brought to her knees by his lies. She had fought back once, and she would do it again. The following week, Brianna sat across from Evelyn Mercer in her lawyer's downtown office. The defamation suit was now officially in motion, and Evelyn had already begun preparing their defense. The walls of the office were covered in legal books and case files, a testament to Evelyn's extensive experience in civil rights cases. Defamation is notoriously difficult to prove, Evelyn began, her tone calm but firm, especially in cases involving public figures, which you've become. Daniel's team will have to prove that you made statements that were false and that those statements caused damage to his reputation. Given everything that happened in the trial, I don't think they have much of a case. But they're still going to try, Brianna replied, her voice edged with frustration. They're going to drag this out, try to paint me as some kind of villain. And it's not just about me. This could damage everything I'm working for. The reforms, the movement. Evelyn nodded, understanding her concerns. I won't lie to you, Brianna. This is going to get ugly. They're going to dig into your personal life, your past, anything they can use to discredit you. But we'll be ready. We'll counter their claims with the truth, just like we did before. And if they want to take this to court, we'll fight them every step of the way. Brianna sighed, leaning back in her chair. She had already been through one grueling legal battle, and the thought of going through another filled her with exhaustion. But she knew she couldn't back down now. Too much was at stake. As news of Daniel Hayes' defamation lawsuit broke, the media frenzy reignited. Headlines painted the lawsuit in varying shades. Some sided with Brianna, seeing the lawsuit as a baseless attempt by a disgraced officer to salvage his reputation. Others, however, questioned whether Brianna had overstepped in her public statements after the trial. Social media was abuzz with opinions from both sides. Supporters of Brianna rallied behind her, using hashtags like #JusticeForBrianna and #StandWithBrianna to show their solidarity. But there were also those who sided with Daniel, claiming that he had been unfairly vilified and that Brianna's advocacy work had gone too far. Brianna did her best to stay focused, but it was difficult to ignore the chatter. Every time she turned on the TV or checked her phone, there was a new article or post dissecting her every move. The pressure was immense, and the weight of public scrutiny felt heavier than ever. But through it all, Brianna reminded herself why she was fighting. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about holding people like Daniel accountable, about changing a system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. As the lawsuit dragged on, Brianna found herself struggling to maintain a sense of normalcy in her personal life. The constant legal battles, the media attention, and the pressures of her growing role in the reform movement were taking their toll. Her relationship with Marcus, her brother, remained strong, but even he could see the strain she was under. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and media inquiries, Marcus stopped by her apartment to check on her. "You look exhausted, Bri," Marcus said, sitting down on the couch beside her. "I feel exhausted," Brianna admitted, rubbing her temples. "It's like there's no end to this. Every time I think I'm making progress, something else happens to knock me back." "You're doing more than making progress," Marcus replied, his tone serious. "You're changing things. People are listening to you. The reforms you're pushing for, the awareness you're raising, it's working. But you need to take care of yourself too. This lawsuit, it's just another hurdle. You'll get through it." Brianna sighed, leaning her head back against the couch. I know, but it's hard to keep going when it feels like there's always another fight around the corner. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a reassuring squeeze. You're not alone in this. Remember that. Despite the ongoing lawsuit, Brianna continued to push forward with her advocacy work. She had become a prominent voice in the fight for police reform, and her platform was only growing. Community leaders, civil rights groups, and activists from across the country reached out to her, offering their support and asking her to join their efforts. One of the most significant moments came when Brianna was invited to speak at a national civil rights conference in Washington, D.C. The conference was a gathering of some of the most influential leaders in the movement for racial justice, and Brianna's story had resonated with many of them. As she stood before the crowd of hundreds, Brianna felt a surge of nerves, but also a deep sense of purpose. She had never seen herself as a public speaker, but this was different. This was her chance to share her story, to speak out against the injustices she had faced, and to call for the systemic changes that were so desperately needed. I didn't ask to be in this position, Brianna began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I didn't ask to become a symbol for justice or to lead a movement. But the truth is, we don't always get to choose the battles we fight. Sometimes those battles choose us. The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a system that has been broken for far too long. A system that allows people like Daniel Hayes to abuse their power, to operate with impunity, and to destroy lives without consequence. And it's time for that to change. As Brianna spoke, she could feel the weight of the room shifting. People were listening, truly listening, and she knew that her voice had the power to make a difference. While Brianna's advocacy work was gaining momentum, the defamation lawsuit continued to escalate. Daniel's legal team, determined to paint Brianna as a reckless agitator, began dredging up details from her past, hoping to find something they could use against her. They combed through her social media posts, interviews, and even her old police records, looking for any inconsistencies or statements they could twist to their advantage. The pressure mounted and Brianna felt like she was under constant surveillance, every aspect of her life scrutinized and dissected. Evelyn, ever the fierce advocate, worked tirelessly to counter their claims, but even she knew that this lawsuit wasn't just about the law, it was about public perception. Daniel's team was trying to win in the court of public opinion, and that was a battle that could be just as difficult to fight as the one in the courtroom. One evening, as Brianna sat in Evelyn's office, reviewing the latest developments in the case, Evelyn looked up from her papers with a serious expression. Brianna, we need to talk strategy, Evelyn said, her tone measured. Daniel's team is trying to wear us down. They're hoping that if they keep digging, they'll find something they can use to discredit you. But we need to stay focused on the truth. Brianna nodded, though her mind was racing. So what do? We stay ahead of them, Evelyn replied, leaning forward. We continue to build our case, focusing on the facts. We remind the court and the public of what really happened, and we don't let them intimidate us. Brianna took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever. As the lawsuit progressed, Brianna and her legal team received an unexpected breakthrough. A former colleague of Daniel's came forward, offering to testify against him. The colleague, an officer who had worked with Daniel for several years, had witnessed firsthand Daniel's history of misconduct and his animosity toward Brianna. Evelyn was quick to bring the witness into the fold, knowing that this testimony could be the key to turning the case in Brianna's favor. The officer, a man named Rick, had retired from the force a few years earlier, but had followed Brianna's case closely. He had kept quiet during the original trial, but could no longer stay silent as he saw Daniel continue his attempts to destroy Brianna. During his deposition, Rick recounted several incidents where Daniel had shown blatant disregard for protocol and had made discriminatory comments about both Brianna and other officers of color. He also revealed that Daniel had privately expressed his intention to take Brianna down, long before the theft accusation had been made. This was personal for Daniel, Rick said, his voice steady but firm. He couldn't stand the fact that a black woman had outranked him. He was looking for any excuse to take her down. Rick's testimony was a bombshell, and it sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The judge allowed the testimony to be entered into evidence, and suddenly Daniel's case began to unravel. As the trial moved into its final stages, Brianna's legal team focused on driving home the truth. They presented Rick's testimony, along with the evidence from the original trial, to show that everything Brianna had said about Daniel was not only true but supported by multiple witnesses and records. Daniel's team, desperate to salvage their case, tried to discredit Rick, but the damage had already been done. The court and the public could see through their tactics, and it became clear that this lawsuit was nothing more than an attempt to silence Brianna and protect Daniel's tarnished reputation. When it came time for closing arguments, Evelyn stood before the court with the confidence of someone who knew the truth was on her side. "This case isn't about defamation," Evelyn began, her voice strong and unwavering. "It's about accountability. Brianna Wilson stood up against a system that had wronged her, and now she's being punished for it. But the facts speak for themselves. Daniel Hayes abused his power, and when his lies were exposed, he tried to shift the blame onto the very person he had wronged. We cannot allow that to happen. Justice must prevail." After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Brianna sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest as the judge read the decision. "We, the jury, find in favor of the defendant, Brianna Wilson." A wave of relief washed over Brianna as the words sank in. She had won. Again. The defamation suit had been dismissed, and Daniel's attempt to discredit her had failed. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the trial. Brianna felt the weight of the past months lift from her shoulders, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe. With the defamation lawsuit behind her, Brianna could finally focus on the work that mattered most: advocating for justice and reform. The victory in court had only strengthened her resolve, and she knew that the fight was far from over. But now she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been wronged by a broken system, for everyone who had been silenced or discredited for speaking out. And with the support of her community, her family, and her colleagues, Brianna knew that she was ready for whatever came next. As she left the courthouse surrounded by supporters and the flashing lights of cameras, Brianna smiled. She had faced the storm and come out stronger. The fight for justice would continue. But now Brianna Wilson was leading the charge.